So the second section, and for those of you who are in Scripture Track with me, this is actually where we spend about 6 to 7 weeks diving into this a little farther. So we're going to do a very, very truncated version of that. If you're interested in diving into this farther, everybody here, further. I got corrected by that earlier. It's like, okay, so further is taking something further. Farther is actually a distance. You learn something every day. So if you're going to look into this further, I would recommend anybody to come to Scripture Track. It's 6 o'clock on Sundays, straight across the auditorium, and what used to be our primary auditorium, where we dive a lot more into the specifics about who Jesus is, how do we know Christianity is true. But since I've got about 30 minutes this morning, we're going to dive into it and do a little bit. So the question is the creator of the universe, so we've scientifically proven that somebody had to create this. There was a supernatural power that created the world. Is that creator the God of the Bible? So the question is, what does the evidence say about Jesus? And I bring us back to the 3 things that have to be true for Christianity to be true. If Jesus is the divine Son of God, he was crucified on a cross, and he was resurrected, then Christianity is true. If any one of those or all of those things are not true, then Christianity is not true. So what we're going to start is looking at who did Jesus claim to be? Because that's a very important part of this, right? If somebody makes a claim, then they need to back up that claim. What claims did Jesus make, and did Jesus back up those claims? And then what did people who were not Christians say about Jesus? And this is really interesting because Jesus was written about more than any other historical person. Because of all of the influence that he had. So the existence of Jesus of Nazareth as a person is not a disputable matter. There's more evidence about him than anything else. So people are saying, do you have faith that Jesus was a real person? I would say, no, I don't have faith that Jesus is a real person. I can know that Jesus was a real person. And I would say, it's like, do I have to have faith that George Washington was the first president of the United States? No, I don't have faith that George Washington is the first president of the United States. I know he is because there were tons of people all over the world and in England and everybody that was writing about who George Washington was from multiple sources, recording the things that he did, both as a general and as the president of the United States. And it's like you can look at so many different things. There's no possible way that could have been some kind of conspiracy for somebody to make them up. So if you believe that George Washington is a real person, then you have more information and more evidence that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person. So the question is was Jesus of Nazareth the person that he claimed to be? So we're going to look at 3 types of sources. The first type of sources are favorable sources. So for the Christians in the room, the primary source of information about Jesus from a favorable perspective is the Gospels, the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's also a lot of Christians who wrote about Jesus in the first century when Jesus was doing his ministry that are not recorded for us in the Bible. But for the purpose of this section, I'm actually going to focus more on the last 2 categories, and those are neutral sources. So neutral sources were historians that were covering modern-day events back when Jesus was doing his ministry. So just like if you were a historian in the United States in the early 2000s, you would cover 9/11 because it was a huge event. It had massive impact. You couldn't call yourself a historian in the United States 20 years ago and not talk about the attacks of September 11th. You couldn't be a historian in the Middle East when the time that Jesus was doing his ministry and not talk about Jesus, because that's what everybody else was talking about. And then there are unfavorable sources, and these are people that are opposed to the teachings of Jesus. So Jesus had a lot of people that did not like him when he was around. In fact, they killed him, right? So they recorded a lot of things about what Jesus said, and when we look at what they say, they actually validate the things that Jesus did by trying to disprove them. It's really a very interesting body of evidence. So I'm going to look at all 3 of these sources validate that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. There's no debate whether or not Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, claimed to be God. But if you look at, I do want to look at the favorable sources real quick here, because the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were writing what they saw. And the question is did they believe what they saw? And we'll get into this, why this is important here in a little bit later in the session. But it's very clear that the apostles believed that what they were teaching was true. Because if you look at the apostles, they had very miserable, physical existences after. They were being persecuted. In fact, 11 of the 12 apostles who were Jesus' closest followers, who followed him all through his 3 years of ministry, 11 out of the 12 of them were killed for what they were teaching, and most of them were killed brutally. Hung upside down on a cross, tortured, stoned. They were all mistreated because of what they were teaching. So nobody teaches something that they think is a lie if that's the treatment they're going to get for what they were teaching. In fact, the only apostle who didn't get killed was the apostle John, and he was actually tortured and boiled. So he was in bad shape too, but he ended up living to an old age. No apostle was wealthy or physically advantaged in any way. In fact, a couple of the apostles were actually the opposite. So Matthew, who wrote the first book in the New Testament, was actually a tax collector. So he would have been like a comfortable upper middle class person at that point in time. He would have had more wealth than most people. He would have had a comfortable life, kind of protected by the Roman authorities. And when he became a follower of Jesus, he threw all that away and said, "No, I'm gonna follow Jesus." And his life was never as comfortable as it was before. Also, the Apostle Paul, who wrote 13 of the books in the New Testament, he was a Pharisee at that time. He was a prominent Pharisee, which would have been kind of the equivalent of a United States senator. So not only did he have power and influence, but he had wealth. And then when he became a follower of Jesus, he left all of that. And then we have recorded, he was stoned multiple times, he was shipwrecked, he was put in prison. Like, his life was one trial after another, and he gave up all of that comfort in order to follow Jesus. So there's no question that the apostles believed what they were writing. But if we look at some of the other writings, some of the unfavorable writings, like Roman officials that didn't believe in the deity of Jesus actually reinforced that, one, Jesus was a real person. They verify that miraculous things happened, and they try to explain those miraculous things away. But in trying to explain them away, they kind of expose that actually did happen. So there's a few of these people that I want to look at, and I'm just going to introduce them really quick for the sake of time, and then I'm going to give you the summary of what they said, but I'd really encourage you to look into this a lot more. So for this particular section, there's more good books available than any of the other sections. So if you have not, oh, by the way, if you haven't scanned the QR code yet, we're giving away some books afterwards. So scan the QR code and register, and then we'll give away a few books afterwards. One of the books we're going to give away is The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. If you haven't read that one, it's a really good overview and has a lot more information on some of these types of things. Evidence That Demands a Verdict is by J. Warner Wallace. He's actually one of my personal favorite apologists, and he really looks at the reliability of the Gospels and who the Gospel writers were and how we can know that what they wrote was true. And then the other one to look at is down there at the bottom, Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. If you're interested in apologetics and you really want to dive into it a lot deeper, that's like a must-have. It's more like a textbook than it is a story that you're reading, but it's a phenomenal resource. So all I'm wanting to do today is just kind of pique your interest enough to make you want to dive into it a little more on your own. I don't want you to take my word for anything. I want you to take what we've started here today and run with it. So anyway, some of these non-favorable sources. Josephus is a neutral source, and he lived from 37 to 100 AD, but he wrote about the time right after Jesus had ascended and followed all of his followers from that time on. And he verifies the conclusions that Jesus was a wise and virtuous man with a significant following of both Jewish and non-Jewish disciples. And he verifies that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He also verifies that there were reports that he appeared to eyewitnesses following his resurrection, and that some people were claiming that he was the Messiah that the Jewish prophets had predicted. See, notice the difference. This isn't information trying to convince you that Jesus was who he says he is. He's just saying, these are the things that I observed from his followers. There's all these people saying that they interacted with Jesus after his resurrection. So that's a data point that we can use. That's one piece of evidence that helps paint the picture. Tacitus is another guy who's kind of interesting, and I don't have a ton of information about him up here, but he's a really good study. But he was a Roman official who recorded the history of the Roman Empire starting in 14 AD. And again, Jesus was a dominating historical figure during that time, so Tacitus wrote a lot about Jesus and the things that he did. So Tacitus was not a Christian. He did not believe in the deity of Jesus, and many of his writings were designed to naturally explain the miraculous things that occurred during the life of Jesus. Then there's this other guy named Thallus, and Thallus is interesting. I'm going to bring him up because of some very specific things that he wrote. So Thallus was around from 5 AD to 60 AD, which was, remember, his ministry, he was crucified in 30 AD. So that would have been right in the middle of all of this. And he records an event. So he was a Roman historian that lived in Rome. And he records this event that happened one day, not necessarily linking it to Jesus at all, but he says, on the whole world, there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea is where Jesus was doing his ministry, and other districts were thrown down. So this earthquake was big, it was a big deal, it did a lot of damage. He says, this darkness, Thallus, in the third book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. So what he said is, in the middle of the day, the earth just went dark. And Thallus is over here in Rome, and Jesus is over here being crucified in Judea. Rome and Judea, they're not close to each other. That's a really long distance. And he's trying to explain this away as a solar eclipse. But we know from observational science, I love science, it always keeps coming back up. From observational science, we know when all of the solar eclipses and where they would have happened for the next 2,000 years and the last 2,000 years. Why? Because we can observe how the moon rotates around the earth. I remember when I was a kid in elementary school, we had a solar eclipse, and them telling us like, oh, you're going to see another one of these in like 2018, and thinking, that's a long time away. And then you know what? In 2018, we got another one, and it was centered right over St. Joe, and it was a big deal, and it was really cool. But they knew that was coming 30 years ahead of time because we understand how those bodies work with each other. Well, we can also look at that backwards. Like, when have all of the solar eclipses happened over the last 2,000 years? And if you look back, there were no solar eclipses anywhere in the world at the time when Jesus was doing his ministry. So we have this event that we can't do. So we're saying, okay, did Jesus validate who he was? Are there things that happened that showed that he was speaking truth? So if we go to the Bible, there's a book in the Old Testament called Amos. And in the book of Amos, just to kind of set this up, the nation of Israel was in captivity. They had turned their back on God. Things were not good for them. They were in captivity. But God had made a promise earlier in the Bible to say, at some point, I'm going to restore you when the Messiah comes. It's saying, at some point, you are going to be restored back. And Jesus was the fulfillment of that promise. They didn't realize that in Amos, so they said, how are we going to know when it's going to be restored? How are we going to know who the Messiah is? So now if you look at Amos chapter 8, verse 9, it says, on that day, with that background, on that day that the Messiah comes to rescue you, declares the Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. So let's fast forward to Matthew chapter 7, verse 45, and on the day that Jesus was being crucified, the earth went dark from noon until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So Matthew chapter 27, verse 45 says specifically, now at the 6th hour, noon, there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. So they started their day when the sun came up. So the 6th hour is noon, 9th hour would be about 3 o'clock. And this is what Thallus is talking about over here. This was something a lot of historians wrote about because it was a massive event. Could you imagine if the sun just went away for 3 hours in the middle of the day and there was complete darkness? You'd write about it too. So we talk about these prophecies, and I know some people are like, well, how do you know the prophecies were written ahead of time? Well, just in this is a little bit of a side note here. Just in the last 100 years, we've actually archaeology has found copies of these prophecies in the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everybody, even skeptics of Christianity, say, yeah, these documents were written before the time of Jesus. So now we have proof that 600 years before Jesus was born, that this was written down, and then we have this being fulfilled on the day that Jesus was crucified and being validated by people who hated Christians thousands of miles away in Rome. Okay, these are what we're talking about when we're talking about prophecies. These aren't going to a palm reader and being like, something's good's going to happen to you tomorrow. Like, this is like, there's no way to make this up. There's no way to falsify this, right? This is verified by all of these external sources. So there's actually over 300 individual prophecies about Jesus. So we're obviously not going to get into all of that today, but this is just one that's so strongly validated by other people that I thought it was worth bringing into this. So, sorry, I talk ahead of my slides a lot, so sorry about that. So we have the fulfillment in Matthew chapter 27. I don't think there's any notes in your slides on, or any blanks in your slides on this one. And then there's another guy. His name's Phlegon, and he's another unfavorable person for Jesus. In his book of Chronicles, he ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events and testified that the result of what actually happened corresponded to Jesus' prediction. So he's like, yeah, Jesus said all these things, and then exactly what he said was going to happen came true. And he tried to explain that away, but in the process of explaining that away, he actually proves that Jesus had miraculous knowledge of what was going to happen in the future. Again, from somebody who was not a Christian. So if you summarize just the things that Thallus and Tacitus and Phlegon and Josephus, just the things that they wrote and they verified, these are conclusions that you can draw and the things that you can know. Pieces of evidence that we're going to look at is that Jesus lived in Judea. He was a virtuous man. He had wondrous power. He could predict the future. He was called the wise king of the Jews. He was accused by Jewish leaders, crucified by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. There was darkness in the earthquake that we talked about. He was reported to have rose after death. He was believed to be the Messiah. He was called the Christ. His followers were called Christians. And then these guys claimed that it was a superstition that spread. He's talking about how Christianity spread. We can know all of these things objectively from people who don't even believe in Jesus. So, the conclusion that we can draw from this is that the existence of Jesus is a historical fact. It's really undisputed by skeptics. No serious historian can deny the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, as recorded by multiple people. The crowds with Jesus believed he performed miracles, and then he made predictions that even his skeptics said appeared to come true. So when we look at that body of evidence, what can we conclude from that? Is that Jesus was who he says he is, and he backed it up with multiple miraculous claims verified by lots and lots of independent eyewitnesses. So I want to move forward into kind of the second part of this, is that because the existence of Jesus of Nazareth is a historical fact, just like the existence of George Washington is a historical fact, people who are not Christians will attack the death and the resurrection of Jesus, right? They can't attack that he wasn't a real person. They can say, well, he must not have died or he must not have been resurrected. Right? That's what they would say. So 99% of non-Christians that study this would come to this conclusion. So there's two theories on why people believe that Jesus was crucified and resurrected that would be opposed to Christianity. So I want to address each one of these theories real quick. Theory number one is that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. So that Jesus came back or kind of healed himself. He wasn't dead, he was just asleep, and then, after time he was able to kind of get better, and then he was able to walk around. And that's why everybody said, oh, he was resurrected, because they were seeing him after his crucifixion. So where does this idea come from? And this actually comes from the Quran. So you have 1 billion people on the planet that believe the Quran, that believe that Jesus, but they believe what's in there. And it says that Jesus didn't die, he only appeared to die. Because the Quran talks about Jesus as a prophet. The problem with this is even the independent American Medical Association doctors have concluded that it was impossible for Jesus to survive crucifixion. If you understand what happened to somebody during crucifixion, then there's just no way for them and to survive that. And the Roman guards, the people that were doing this crucifixion, they were experts in death, right? They had developed the most cruel form of punishment in the history of the world up to that point, and that to crucify people. So they knew what death looked like. They did this all day, every day. In fact, if they didn't crucify somebody or they messed it up, they could actually be killed for messing it up. But the problem with theory number one is that it doesn't account for the ascension. Right? So where did Jesus go after he ascended, right? Why did he just, if he was still alive, like what happened to him? Where did he go? It also doesn't account for all of the conversions after the resurrection, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But then it just flat out isn't medically possible for somebody to subscribe to that. And it's my belief that if it wasn't in the Quran, that nobody would seriously hold to that view today, because it's just so out of the realm of what is physically possible. So that brings us to theory number two. And theory number two is that the apostles stole the body and then they made up the story. So where does this come from? This is actually recorded for us in Scripture. At the end of the book of Matthew, the Roman guards went and told people everything that had happened, that the angels had come and rolled away the tomb, and that Jesus was alive, and that there were people that he left with. They told all those things to the Roman authorities, and the Roman authorities say, well, just tell them that the apostles stole the body, and we'll handle it. We'll cover it for you. So this was from the very, very beginning what people were told to say, and Matthew says they believe it to this day. Now, to this day, so Matthew wrote his gospel about 25 to 30 years after these events happened. So 25 to 30 years later, we still see the prominence of this theory that the apostles stole the body and made up the story. But the problem with this theory is that the apostles all died for this belief. Like, people will die for things all the time, but they don't die for things that they know is false. Right? They only, especially something that they made up. If you made something up and somebody said, denounce it or I'll kill you, you would denounce it because you know that it's not true. You don't die for things that you know are false. But it also doesn't account for all of the post-resurrection encounters. There were thousands of people who saw and interacted with Jesus after he was resurrected. In Corinthians, Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he's talking with them about this, and he said Jesus appeared to over 500 of you at the same time. And he said, many of you remember this. So he's writing that letter about 25 years later. So a lot of the people that Jesus appeared to remembered that event. They were eyewitnesses of that event. How could all of that happen? If the apostles stole the body and made up the story, then how do all these post-resurrection encounters happen? Another thing that's important to remember is that the Jews and the Romans were never able to refute this claim. So this was like on Sunday and Monday, after Jesus was crucified on Friday, people were talking about seeing the resurrected Jesus. Well, the Jewish leaders were the ones that crucified Jesus. The Roman leaders didn't want anybody to kind of rise up. They didn't want any problems on their hands. That's why they went along with the crucifixion of Jesus in the first place. So it was in all of their interests to refute this claim. And all they would have had to have done to refute this claim is to produce the body. But they couldn't produce the body. Remember, they were the ones with all the resources. The apostles didn't have resources. They were, living in tents, kind of nomads running around. In fact, they just didn't have any way to pull this off. But the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders could have disproven it had they been able to find a body. But there was no body to be found. So these are all pieces of evidence, again, that add up to validating that what the accounts that we have in the Bible are true. There's also other problems with this. So if the apostles were to make up a story, this is not the story they would have made up. Because the first thing is the first people to the tomb were women. And back in AD 30, women were not considered reliable witnesses in a court of law. Their testimony was not counted as much as a man's testimony. So the only reason that you would record that women were the first to the tomb is if you were telling people what actually happened. If you were going to make it up, that's not what you would say. So the biblical accounts of the apostles also are not flattering to the apostles. If you look at the apostles in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, like they're constantly making mistakes. Like if you were going to make something up, you wouldn't paint yourself in that picture unless you were trying to accurately portray what happened. And again, then the apostles themselves were changed men after they encountered the resurrected Jesus. If you look at the things that they did in Acts after Jesus is resurrected and the boldness that they had when they preached, it was completely different than how they were before they saw the resurrected Jesus. So the other question is, could the body have been stolen by someone else? And the problem with that is that there was a body, there was no body, and there was a story, right? So if the body had been stolen by somebody else, the story still would have come from the apostles. So that doesn't fix our problem, right? This is one of the critiques with that. Say like, oh, the body was stolen, so the apostles made up the story. No, the apostles couldn't have made up the story because of how they were treated and what they saw afterwards. It doesn't make any sense. There's a number of reasons why people would lie, and none of those reasons fit the apostles, right? For self-preservation, for power or wealth, for some kind of relational advantage over somebody else. Like there's all the reasons that we see people lie today. None of those reasons fit the apostles. So, also with conversions after the resurrection, if you look at some of the initial church leaders, so James, who was the half-brother of Jesus, the son of Joseph and Mary, he was not a believer when Jesus was crucified, but he became a believer and one of the more prominent leaders in the church after Jesus was resurrected. The apostle Paul was a Pharisee, again, prominent, think United States Senator. He was running around killing Christians because he believed they were opposed to God when he had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus, and his life turned completely around for 180 degrees. And then in Acts chapter 2, so Acts is the book that starts right after Jesus' ascension, the church actually began with 3,000 people on the day of Pentecost. And among those 3,000 people were a lot of the followers of Jesus who had witnessed the resurrection. So it was those people among them that had witnessed the resurrection that actually began the church. So if you look at all of this, if all of this from the beginning, there was a blank on there. So the early church was made up of eyewitnesses, and that's an important part. So we talk about what launched the church. The church was made up of a lot of people who saw this for themselves. And again, we haven't even gotten into the other 299 prophecies of Jesus in this class, but there is so much overwhelming evidence that Jesus backed up the claims that he made about who he was, that the natural conclusion, just like if you look at the evidence of how the world was created, it shows that there's a creator. This evidence proves that Jesus is who he said he is, and that he backed that up, and he fulfilled those claims. He fulfilled those prophecies. He made those claims, and he proved who he was. So that is the very, very quick summary of section 2. Let's go ahead and take another 10-minute break, and then let's say at 9:50 we'll come back and we'll do Q&A for the next session. Sound good? So anyway, I did get a couple of other cards during the break, and one of the questions was, are there any reports of unbelievers who witnessed the ascension of Jesus on the day of Pentecost in the crowd of 3,000? So this would be somebody who witnessed the ascension of Jesus who did not become a Christian, who did not become a follower of Jesus. I am not aware off the top of my head of any specific instances of that. There were more than 3,000. Okay, a couple clarifications about that. Not all of the 3,000 people witnessed Jesus' resurrection, right? There were people in the crowd that kind of started the movement and said, so Peter gets up and he explains to everybody what happened and how Jesus had been predicted, and that it actually, you ended up killing the Messiah that came that you were looking for, and they realized that they had done this, and then they are very repentant, right? That idea of, okay, we realize who Jesus is now, and we're repentant and we turn to him. There were 3,000 people in that crowd that did that. Not all of them are witnesses of the resurrection, but that there's kind of an assumption in there that there were more than 3,000 people that potentially saw this. In fact, some of the people initially, when the apostles started speaking, were making fun of them. Like, are they, because the apostles were speaking, and then that was being heard in everybody's native language. So a lot of people were in this area. It'd be like going to Times Square and people speak different languages from different countries. When the apostles were speaking, all of the people were hearing that in their native language. So they're like, what is going on with these guys? What's going on? Are they drunk, at 9 o'clock in the morning? So there were people making fun of them. So there is an assumption there that some of those people did not believe, even though they were part of that crowd. There's 3,000 people that did believe that we have recorded for us in the book of Acts. So anyway, that was a really good question as well. Did I miss any, by the way? Did anybody have any cards they wanted to bring up that I didn't get? We can certainly cover them after the next section if you want to.